In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, some secrets are worth millions. Others are worth destroying a life. For Jessica Collins, the secret she carried wasn't in a Swiss bank account. It was in her womb. She was the pregnant wife of real estate mogul Jonathan Pierce, a man who built skyscrapers and a flawless public image. But when that image was threatened, he didn't just walk away. He betrayed her, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his promises. His stunning mistress, Vanessa Dubois, took her place in the tabloids and in their home. Everyone watched as the mistress shone, believing the story was over. They were all wrong. The story was just beginning, because in the shadows, a titan of industry was watching a billionaire investor who knows one thing better than anyone: every empire built on lies will eventually fall. The penthouse apartment on Park Avenue was less a home and more a curated exhibition of success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan, the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of fallen stars. Polished marble floors reflected the recessed lighting and the museum-quality art that adorned the walls. This was the world Jonathan Pierce had built, and Jessica Collins, his wife of 5 years, was its most prized exhibit. To the outside world, they were a power couple. Jonathan, with his sharp suits, impossibly white teeth, and a reputation for turning forgotten city blocks into gold mines, was the city's golden boy. Jessica, with her understated grace and a quiet intelligence that often went unnoticed in her husband's blinding spotlight, was the perfect complement. She had been a promising architect herself before meeting Jonathan, her designs praised for their blend of sustainable materials and soulful aesthetics. But his ambition had been an ocean, and hers a quiet stream was soon swallowed by it. She managed their homes, organized the charity galas, and smoothed over the ruffled feathers of egos. Jonathan bruised on his relentless climb to the top. Lately, however, the gilded cage had begun to feel more like a prison. Jonathan's late nights at the office became more frequent, his explanations briefer. The scent of an unfamiliar expensive perfume, a jasmine and sandalwood blend far too cloying for Jessica's taste, sometimes clung to his coat. When she'd ask, he'd wave a dismissive hand. Networking, Jess. You know how it is. It's for us. It was always for us. The 80-hour work weeks, the cancelled anniversary dinners, the coldness that had crept into their king-sized bed. It was all for the empire, for their future. But Jessica had a secret, a fragile, hopeful secret she held close to her heart. For 2 months she had known. She was pregnant, after years of quiet yearning and one heartbreaking miscarriage that Jonathan had treated as little more than an inconvenient scheduling conflict. It had finally happened. She'd waited for the perfect moment to tell him, hoping it would be the spark that reignited the warmth they'd lost, the foundation upon which they could rebuild. She chose a Tuesday evening. He had just closed the landmark deal for the Azure Spire, a residential skyscraper that would pierce the skyline and cement his legacy. He came home smelling of champagne and victory. "We did it, Jess," he'd boomed, tossing his briefcase onto a $30,000 Italian leather sofa. Forbes is calling it the deal of the decade. We're not just millionaires anymore. We're on a whole new level. He barely looked at her. His eyes were fixed on the city beyond the glass, as if he owned every light. "That's amazing, Jay," she said softly, her hand unconsciously drifting to her still flat stomach. "I have some amazing news, too. Something to celebrate?" He finally turned to her, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "Don't tell me you bought that ridiculous, abstract painting from the Soho Gallery. We're past that. We need a Rothko, a de Kooning." "No, it's not that." She took a deep breath, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Jonathan, I'm pregnant." The triumphant smile on his face didn't fade, but it froze. It became a mask, the light in his eyes dimming. He stared at her, his mind clearly racing, processing this new data point, not as a husband, but as a CEO, evaluating a sudden, unexpected variable. "Pregnant," he repeated the word, sounding foreign in his mouth. "Are you sure?" "Yes, of course I'm sure. I saw Dr. Miller this morning. I'm almost 10 weeks along. We're having a baby, Jay." Her voice trembled with a joy that was seeking desperately to be mirrored. He walked to the bar, his back to her, and poured himself a scotch. The clink of the decanter against the glass was the only sound in the room. "A baby," he said to the window. "The timing is complicated. The Azure Spire project is going to consume everything for the next 2 years. Board meetings, investors, international press." Jessica's hope began to curdle into a familiar dread. "A baby is not a complication, Jonathan. It's a blessing. It's our family." He finally turned around, the scotch swirling in his glass. "Right. Of course, a family." He walked over and gave her a perfunctory kiss on the forehead. It was cold, sterile. "We'll need to hire the best nanny. Get on the wait list for the top preschools, and we'll need to make a public announcement. It's good for the brand." The family man developer. Stable. Trustworthy. He was talking about their child as if it were a press release. The joy she had carried so carefully within her shattered. She saw it then with horrifying clarity. He wasn't building a future for them. He was building one for himself, and she and their unborn child were just strategic assets to be managed. That night, Jessica lay awake long after his breathing had settled into a deep, untroubled sleep. She stared at the city lights, the same lights he looked at, with a sense of ownership, and for the first time she felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The chill in the room had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the dawning, awful realization that the man she loved had been replaced by a stranger, and she was trapped in his gilded cage with a baby on the way. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in emotional disconnect. Jonathan played the part of the expectant father for the public. He'd place a proprietary hand on Jessica's belly when photographers were near at charity events, his smile perfectly calibrated for the cameras. He spoke to magazines about the importance of legacy and building a world for the next generation. But in the sterile quiet of their penthouse, he was a ghost. The unfamiliar perfume became a constant, unwelcome guest. It was on his shirts when they came back from a dry cleaner he'd never used before in the passenger seat of his car, and once faintly on a pillowcase. Jessica's questions were met with a new kind of weapon gaslighting. "You're being hormonal, Jess. Pregnancy is making you paranoid. She's an associate from the firm in Paris. Are you really this insecure? We're about to have a child. Do you honestly think I have time for anything else?" He made her feel like she was losing her mind. She started to doubt her own senses, to believe that the stress of the pregnancy was making her irrational. She tried to cling to the memory of the man she had married, the one who had once sketched their dream house on a napkin during their first date. But that man was gone. The truth, when it came, was not a whisper overheard or a stray text message found. It was a brutal public spectacle, orchestrated with chilling precision. It happened at the annual Metropolitan Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of New York's social calendar. Jessica, now visibly pregnant in a custom-made navy silk gown, felt a fragile sense of hope. Jonathan had been attentive all evening, holding her hand, fetching her sparkling water, whispering what seemed like sweet nothings in her ear. She allowed herself to believe just for a moment that the baby was changing him, that the reality of fatherhood was finally breaking through his corporate armor. He was on stage accepting an award for visionary urban development. He stood at the podium, a golden statue in his hand. The crowd of 1,000 of the city's most powerful people hanging on his every word. I wouldn't be here without the unwavering support of my incredible team. He began, his voice smooth and confident, and the inspiration I draw from the person who truly understands my vision, who pushes me to be bolder, to reach higher. Jessica smiled, her eyes glistening. He was going to thank her. In front of everyone, he was going to acknowledge her. He scanned the crowd, and his eyes didn't land on her. They swept right past her table and locked onto someone standing near the back. A woman with fiery auburn hair poured into a crimson dress that seemed painted onto her skin. Jessica recognized her instantly from Instagram's Explore page, Vanessa Dubois, a ruthlessly ambitious PR consultant and socialite who had made a name for herself by attaching her brand to rising stars. Her name is Vanessa Dubois, Jonathan said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom. A spotlight swiveled and landed directly on the woman in red. She didn't look surprised. She looked triumphant. She is the sharpest mind, the most passionate soul I have ever known. She is my partner in all things, and the true architect of my recent success. Vanessa, thank you. The air was sucked out of Jessica's lungs. A confused, polite applause rippled through the room. People at her table exchanged awkward glances. It was a bizarrely effusive tribute to a consultant. But Jessica knew. The way he looked at Vanessa, the way Vanessa preened under the spotlight, the cloying scent of jasmine and sandalwood that suddenly seemed to fill the entire ballroom. It all clicked into place with a sickening finality. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She had to get out. Pushing her chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the sudden lull, she stood up. Every eye in the room turned to her, the visibly pregnant wife publicly disregarded. Her face burned with a shame so intense it was a physical pain. She fled. She stumbled through the maze of tables, her vision blurring with tears. She heard Jonathan call her name from the stage, his tone laced with feigned concern. Jessica. Honey, are you all right? It was just for show. It was all for show. She burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The confrontation happened right there on the steps of the Met, with the flashes of paparazzi cameras going off like strobing landmines. He had followed her out, his face a mask of fury. What the hell do you think you're doing? He hissed, grabbing her arm. You're making a scene. I'm making a scene. She choked out, tears streaming down her face. You just humiliated me in front of our entire world. Jonathan, you dedicated your award to your mistress. Don't be so dramatic. He sneered, his grip tightening. Vanessa is a vital part of my business. You with your hormones and your hysterics are becoming a liability. The word liability struck her harder than a physical blow. It was the coldest, most calculating word he could have used. She looked at this man, the father of her child, and saw nothing but a void. I want her out of our lives, Jessica whispered, her voice shaking. Jonathan laughed. It was a hollow, cruel sound. That's not going to happen. Vanessa is the future. She understands ambition. She isn't afraid to play the game. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You wanted a family. You're getting one. You'll play the part of the devoted mother, and you'll keep your mouth shut. If you don't, I will make sure you walk away with absolutely nothing. Our prenup is ironclad, and my lawyers will paint you as an unstable, vindictive gold digger. Do you think any judge would give a woman like that custody?" The threat hung in the air, suffocating her. He was threatening to take her child. He would use their baby as a weapon. That was the moment the last shred of love she had for him died. It wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a betrayal of their unborn child. He wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a monster. He released her arm, adjusted his tuxedo, and smiled for a nearby camera. "My wife is just a little overwhelmed," he said to the photographer. "The pregnancy, you know." He turned and walked back into the gala, back to the applause, back to Vanessa. Jessica was left alone on the steps, the flashing lights blinding her as the cold, hard truth of her situation settled in. She wasn't just losing her husband. She was in a war she had no idea how to fight. The days following the gala were a descent into a carefully orchestrated hell. Jonathan, true to his word, began a campaign to erase Jessica. It started subtly. The joint credit cards were declined. The car service she used was suddenly unavailable. Staff in the penthouse, who had once been friendly, now looked through her, their instructions clearly coming from a new authority. That authority was Vanessa Dubois. Vanessa didn't just move into Jonathan's life. She executed a corporate takeover of Jessica's existence. She was brilliant in her cruelty, using the very tools of her trade, public relations, and social media to craft a devastating narrative. Her Instagram, once a curated feed of glamorous parties and business travel, transformed. It now featured intimate shots of her and Jonathan laughing over coffee in their kitchen, his hand resting possessively on her waist. Brainstorming over architectural blueprints for the Azure Spire late into the night. Sailing in the Hamptons on the boat Jonathan had named the Jess. Vanessa even posted a photo of herself redecorating the penthouse nursery with a caption that read, "Building a beautiful nest for a new arrival. Some things require a woman's touch." Nesting, future. The tabloids fed a steady stream of anonymous tips from Vanessa's agency ran with the story. Jessica was painted as the cold, frigid wife, the anchor weighing down a visionary genius. Headlines screamed, "Pierce's passion." The woman behind the billion-dollar man and mogul's wife. Emotionally unstable amidst pregnancy. They used the photos of her fleeing the gala, her face streaked with tears as proof of her instability. Jessica was trapped in the penthouse, a prisoner in her own home. Every notification on her phone was a fresh stab of humiliation. Old friends stopped calling their loyalties either bought or intimidated by Jonathan's power. He would come home late, if at all, and act as if she were a piece of furniture he no longer liked, but hadn't yet bothered to throw out. The final brutal act came a week later. Jessica was sitting in the nursery. She had designed a room of soft yellows and gentle greys, clutching a tiny pair of booties when the locks on the front door audibly clicked and changed. A few moments later, a man in a sharp suit, one of Jonathan's lawyers, entered, accompanied by 2 security guards. He didn't make eye contact. Mrs. Pierce, the lawyer, said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Pursuant to the prenuptial agreement, and in light of the impending divorce proceedings, Mr. Pierce has secured this residence. You are to vacate the premises immediately." Jessica stared at him, stunned. "Vacate? This is my home. I'm pregnant with his child. I have nowhere to go. Arrangements have been made." the lawyer said, placing a thin envelope on the table. "Your personal belongings have been packed and are being moved to a prepaid one-bedroom apartment downtown. A check for the amount stipulated in your agreement is enclosed. Mr. Pierce trusts this will be sufficient." He gestured to the security guards who stood impassively by the door. The message was clear. She was being physically removed. The rage, cold and pure, finally burned through her grief and shock. "He can't do this." "He already has," the lawyer said flatly. "I advise you to comply peacefully." As Jessica was escorted out of her home, the elevator doors opened and Vanessa Dubois stepped out. She was wearing one of Jessica's own silk robes, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. She looked Jessica up and down, her gaze lingering on the swell of her belly, with unconcealed disdain. "Don't look so surprised," Vanessa said, her voice a purr. "You were just a placeholder, a starter wife. Some men need a quiet, supportive woman to help them build the foundation. But once the skyscraper is ready for its spire, they need someone who isn't afraid of heights." She ran a perfectly manicured finger along the doorframe of the apartment. "This is my home now. And you are history." The elevator doors closed, and Jessica was left with the lingering scent of jasmine and sandalwood, and the crushing weight of utter defeat. Her new apartment was a sterile corporate leased box in a nondescript building. The check was for $50,000, a pittance, an insult designed to underscore how little she meant. It was just enough to survive for a while, but not enough to fight him. He had taken her home, her reputation, her husband, and her future. That night, huddled on a cheap mattress, surrounded by boxes of what was left of her old life, Jessica finally broke. She didn't just cry. She sobbed with a raw, primal agony for everything she had lost. She was alone, pregnant, and publicly disgraced. Jonathan and Vanessa had won. They were the king and queen of the empire, and she was just a ghost haunting the ruins. As she placed a protective hand on her stomach, a desperate, fierce vow took root in the ashes of her despair. She didn't know how, but she would not let them destroy her child's future. She had to survive. She had to fight back. The first few weeks in the small, anonymous apartment were a blur of survival. The suffocating shame was a constant companion, making it hard to breathe, to eat, to think. The city that had once felt like her playground now seemed hostile, every newspaper stand and phone screen a potential source of fresh pain. Jessica cut herself off from the world, leaving only for obstetrician appointments with Dr. Miller, who looked at her with a sad, knowing pity. The 50,000, which had seemed like an insult, now felt like a lifeline and a ticking clock. She knew Jonathan's lawyers would drag out any formal proceedings, bleeding her dry, until she was forced to accept whatever crumbs he offered. He wasn't just divorcing her. He was trying to grind her into dust. One rainy afternoon, while unpacking a box labeled office, she found them her old portfolios, tubes of architectural drawings, sketchbooks filled with designs, and a hard drive with her student projects from Columbia. She unrolled a blueprint, the paper crinkling with a sound she hadn't heard in years. It was a design for a community library, one that used reclaimed wood and had a living roof. It had won a university prize. She ran her fingers over the clean, precise lines. She remembered the thrill of creation, the satisfaction of solving a spatial puzzle, of making something beautiful and functional out of nothing. It felt like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to a different person. For years, her creative energy had been channeled into Jonathan's world, choosing the right marble for a lobby, the right artist for a gala, the right dress to reflect his status. She had become a curator of his life, forgetting she was once an architect of her own. A flicker of something not hope, it was too early for that, but something like it, a spark of defiance ignited within her. They had taken her name, her home, her money. But they couldn't take this. They couldn't take her talent. She started small. She bought a cheap drafting board and some pencils. At first her hands felt clumsy, her mind rusty. She would sketch for hours, often late into the night when the city was quiet, the baby inside her stirring as if in encouragement. She didn't draw skyscrapers or luxury penthouses. She drew what she cared about: affordable modular family housing, green open-plan community centers, playgrounds that were integrated into nature. Her designs were thoughtful, human-centric, and sustainable, everything Jonathan's cold glass and steel monoliths were not. The work became her sanctuary. It was the one place where she was not Jonathan Pierce's tragic ex-wife. She was Jessica Collins' architect. With every line she drew, she was reclaiming a piece of herself. Her friend Paul, a fellow architect she'd kept in touch with from her university days, was her only link to her old professional life. He was a quiet, unassuming man who had always been immune to Jonathan's flashy charisma. When she finally found the courage to call him, his voice was warm and free of judgment. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you, Jess," he said. "Don't believe a word they're printing. We all know who the real talent was in that partnership." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit. She hesitantly told him she was designing again. He didn't sound surprised. "Good," he said. "The world needs more buildings with a soul." He told her about a new city initiative, a design competition for a multi-purpose community hub in a neglected neighborhood in Brooklyn. It called for a sustainable, innovative design that would include a daycare, a tech lab for seniors, and a rooftop garden. The prize money was substantial, but more importantly, the winning firm would be awarded the contract to build it. "It's a long shot," Jess Paul admitted. "You'd be competing against massive firms, and you'd need to register a business, get certifications. It's a mountain of paperwork." A long shot. It was more than that. It was impossible. She was a one-woman operation, working from a tiny apartment with dwindling funds and a baby due in 4 months. The established firms had teams of draftsmen, engineers, and powerful connections. But the idea took hold. It was a purpose. It was a fight. Winning wasn't the point. Creating something, proving to herself that she could still do it, was. She downloaded the competition brief. For the first time in months, she felt a surge of adrenaline that wasn't born of fear or despair. It was passion. She threw herself into the project. She spent days walking the streets of the Brooklyn neighborhood, talking to residents, understanding their needs. She researched cutting-edge sustainable materials and energy-efficient systems. Her tiny apartment was soon covered in sketches, material samples, and topographical maps. She was building again, not with steel and glass, but with paper and ink. Not for fame or fortune, but for a community. With every stroke of her pen, she was laying the foundation, not just for a building, but for a new life, one that would be entirely her own. She was no longer the humiliated wife or the tabloid victim. In the shadows of her small apartment, she was quietly, painstakingly drawing the blueprint for her own survival. While Jessica was rediscovering her purpose in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, a different kind of architect was watching Jonathan Pierce's empire from a much higher vantage point. His name was Sebastian Shaw, and his domain was not real estate, but capital. He was a billionaire investor, a legend in the world of finance, known for his almost prophetic ability to identify both soaring successes and catastrophic failures long before anyone else. Shaw was in his late 60s, with sharp, discerning eyes that had seen booms and busts, heroes and charlatans. He was a quiet, intensely private man who valued integrity and substance above all else, qualities he found increasingly rare. He wasn't flashy. He wore impeccably tailored but understated suits, and his office, while offering a stunning view of Central Park, was filled with books and antique maps, not garish modern art. Jonathan Pierce's azure spire had been on his radar for months. Shaw's firm had been approached to become a late-stage investor, but something about the project and about Pierce himself had set off his internal alarms. Pierce was too slick, his growth too meteoric. He reminded Shaw of a cheap watch, shiny on the outside, but with poorly made gears inside, destined to stop ticking. Shaw did not rely on press releases or market hype. He employed a team of the best forensic accountants and investigators in the business. He tasked them with a deep dive into Pierce properties. "I want to see everything," he told his lead analyst. "Supply chains, labor contracts, zoning variances, debt structuring. Turn over every rock, especially the ones he doesn't want us to see." The preliminary reports that came back were troubling. Pierce was cutting corners. He was using substandard materials from an overseas supplier with a history of safety violations. He was leveraging the project with a complex web of high-interest loans that left him dangerously exposed. And a zoning variance for the building's controversial height appeared to have been pushed through city planning with suspicious speed, following a generous donation from Pierce to a certain city councilman's pet project. It was a house of cards built to look like a fortress. Jonathan Pierce wasn't a visionary. He was a gambler playing with other people's money. One evening, Shaw was scrolling through the digital edition of the New York Chronicle, reading yet another fawning profile of Pierce and his new partner, Vanessa Dubois. The article lauded them as the city's new it couple, a perfect blend of vision and style. It mentioned Pierce's amicable split from his wife, Jessica Collins, dismissing her in a single sentence as a private citizen who wished to step away from the limelight. The name Jessica Collins pricked at Shaw's memory. He typed her name into his private research database, cross-referencing it with his academic archives. The result was immediate. Jessica Collins, Master of Architecture, Columbia University, class of 2015. Graduated summa cum laude. Winner of the prestigious ARA Student Medal for her thesis project, Urban Oases Integrating Sustainable Community Spaces into High-Density Housing. Shaw leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful frown on his face. He pulled up the digital files on Pierce Properties' early projects, the smaller, more critically acclaimed developments that had first put Jonathan on the map. They were different from the azure spire. They were smarter, more innovative, with a clear focus on community and sustainable design. They bore all the hallmarks of the work of a gifted young architect. They looked a lot like Jessica Collins's award-winning thesis. "Get me everything you can find on her," Shaw instructed his analyst the next morning. Her professional history, her portfolio, everything. The file they compiled was thin. A brilliant academic career, a promising start at a small, prestigious firm. And then, nothing. She had dropped off the professional map right around the time she married Jonathan Pierce. Shaw looked at the photos, the beaming, ambitious young graduate and the haunted, tear-streaked woman fleeing the Met Gala. He then looked back at the blueprints for Pierce's early successes and the cynical, fraudulent plans for the azure spire. The story began to write itself in his mind. The talent hadn't been Jonathan's. It had been hers. He hadn't just married her. He had acquired her, used her genius to build his foundation, and then discarded her when her usefulness was exhausted and her integrity became an inconvenience. It was a pattern he'd seen before: the predator who consumes the talent of others and leaves a trail of wreckage in their wake. And there was nothing Sebastian Shaw despised more than a predator. He had lost a fortune early in his career, betting on a charismatic fraud just like Pierce, and it was a mistake he'd vowed never to repeat. More than that, he had mentored a young entrepreneur years ago who had been ruined by one of Jonathan's ruthless early deals. This was not just business, it was personal. He saw the whole chessboard. Pierce and Dubois were the flashy, aggressive king and queen, making bold, reckless moves in the center of the board. And in the corner, almost forgotten, was a single pawn, Jessica Collins. But Shaw knew that sometimes, if a pawn can make it all the way to the other side, it can become a queen. His interest in the Azure Spire was no longer about a potential investment. It was about dismantling an empire built on lies. And he had just found the perfect person to help him do it. Finding Jessica Collins wasn't difficult for a man with Sebastian Shaw's resources. Tracing her to the nondescript downtown apartment building was the work of a few hours. The approach, however, had to be handled with finesse. She was a woman who had been profoundly betrayed by a powerful, charismatic man. The last thing she would trust was another one. Instead of a formal summons or a cold call from a lawyer, Shaw sent a simple, hand-delivered letter. It was on heavy, cream-colored stationery, with his name embossed at the top. "Dear Ms. Collins, my name is Sebastian Shaw. I am an admirer of your early architectural work, particularly your university thesis on sustainable urban communities. I believe your unique vision is precisely what is lacking in modern development. I am heading a new philanthropic venture focused on innovative urban renewal, and I am seeking a lead design consultant. If you are interested, I would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss it with you at your convenience. Sincerely, Sebastian Shaw." Jessica read the letter 3 times. Sebastian Shaw. The name was legendary, a titan of industry spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. She assumed it was a mistake, or worse, a cruel joke. Perhaps it was even a trap set by Jonathan, a way to test her or lure her into some new form of humiliation. Suspicion warred with a desperate flicker of curiosity. What did a man like Sebastian Shaw want with her? After 2 days of agonizing indecision, she decided to respond. Her life was already at rock bottom. What more did she have to lose? She agreed to a meeting, but on her terms, not at his intimidating office, but at a neutral, quiet cafe in her neighborhood. When Shaw walked into the cafe, he was not what she expected. He was older, with a calm, grandfatherly demeanor that immediately put her at ease. He wasn't flanked by assistants or security. He looked like a university professor, not a ruthless billionaire. He ordered a simple black coffee and waited for her to speak. Jessica was guarded her answers short. She clutched her portfolio from the Brooklyn Community Project like a shield. "Mr. Shaw, I appreciate you reaching out," she began formally. "But I have to be honest. I don't understand why you're here. I haven't practiced architecture in over 5 years. Talent like yours doesn't expire, Ms. Collins. It just becomes dormant," he replied, his gaze direct, but not unkind. "I've reviewed your early designs. I've also reviewed the designs of Pierce Properties' first 5 projects. The architectural DNA is identical. It's yours." Jessica flinched, the statement hitting too close to a truth she had buried for years. "I consulted on those projects, that's all. You were the architect Shaw stated not as a question but as a fact. Jonathan Pierce was the salesman. He sold your vision. And when it was no longer convenient for him, he sold you out. The bluntness of his words knocked the air from her lungs. This man saw everything. Tears pricked at her eyes, and for the first time in months, she didn't bother to fight them. "He's destroying me," she whispered, the confession feeling like a betrayal of her own vow to be strong. "He and that woman, they're telling the world I'm crazy. They've taken everything. They have taken what is replaceable," Shaw said gently. "Money, property, reputation. Those things can be rebuilt. They did not take what is irreplaceable, your integrity and your talent. Jonathan Pierce builds with cheap materials and fraudulent contracts. You build with light and purpose." He gestured to the portfolio she was holding. "May I?" Hesitantly, she pushed it across the table. He opened it and slowly, carefully began to study her drawings for the Brooklyn Community Hub. He didn't just glance at them. He analyzed them, his eyes tracing the flow of the spaces, his fingers lightly touching the details of the schematics. He was silent for a long time. "This is extraordinary," he finally said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. The use of cross-laminated timber, the passive heating and cooling systems, the way the daycare opens into a protected green space. This isn't just a building, Ms. Collins. It's a community. It has a soul. He looked up at her, and his expression was no longer just kind. It was resolute. "I told you I was starting a philanthropic venture. That was only a partial truth. I am starting a new development company, Nexus Properties. Its mission will be to build projects exactly like this one. Projects that prioritize community sustainability and ethical practices. Projects that generate profit by creating real lasting value, not by cutting corners." He leaned forward slightly. "I am not offering you a consulting job, Ms. Collins. I am offering you a partnership. I will provide the capital, the legal team, and the business infrastructure, everything you need. You will be the head of design. You will have complete creative control. We will build Nexus Properties into everything Pierce Properties pretends to be." Jessica was speechless. It was an offer beyond her wildest dreams. But the fear and suspicion were still there. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why, me Shaw's expression hardened slightly. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing authentic visionaries succeed and charismatic frauds fail. I believe in backing talent, and I believe Jonathan Pierce represents a cancer in my industry. Consider this an investment in both good architecture and good karma." He slid a business card across the table. "I have already retained the services of Michelle Lynn from Sterling Cooper and Finch, the best divorce and contract lawyer in the city. She will handle your situation with Mr. Pierce. Your only job will be to design. Build this," he said, tapping her portfolio. "We'll submit this for the Brooklyn competition, not as an individual, but as Nexus Properties. And we will win. Then we will build a dozen more, just like it." The offer hung in the air, a lifeline, a sword, a chance not just for survival, but for triumph. It was a chance to fight back, not by slinging mud, but by building something better. It was a chance to answer Jonathan's cruelty, not with revenge, but with success. Looking into Sebastian Shaw's steady, discerning eyes, Jessica Collins made a choice. She pushed aside the fear and took hold of the hope. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and strong for the first time in months. "Let's get to work." The announcement of Nexus Properties landed like a bombshell in the New York development scene. It wasn't just the news of Sebastian Shaw, the reclusive financial oracle launching a real estate company. It was the name he had chosen as his head of design, Jessica Collins. The story was irresistible to the press. The discarded wife rescued from obscurity by a powerful billionaire. Jonathan and Vanessa were at a gala for the Azure Spire when the news broke. Jonathan saw the headline on his phone, "Shaw backs Pierce's ex in new development venture," and his face went pale under his perfect tan. Vanessa, looking over his shoulder, let out a string of curses that were anything but elegant. Their immediate reaction was derision. Jonathan gave a statement to a friendly reporter dripping with condescension. "I wish Jessica all the best in her little hobby. Sebastian Shaw is a great man, but he's a stock picker, not a developer. I'm sure he'll learn that lesson soon enough." Vanessa was more direct, posting a snide remark on social media. So sweet when powerful old men take an interest in charity cases. Patronage. Some people need handouts. But beneath the public mockery, there was panic. They knew Jessica's talent. More importantly, they knew Sebastian Shaw's reputation. He didn't back hobbies, he built dynasties. The first real shot was fired at the Brooklyn Community Hub competition. The Nexus Properties submission, with Jessica's name and signature on every page, was a masterpiece. It was innovative, cost-effective, and deeply connected to the community's needs. It immediately became the front-runner. Jonathan, through back channels and intermediaries, tried to have her entry disqualified on a technicality. He had his lawyers claim that her designs contained intellectual property, developed while she was consulting for Pierce Properties. The claim was baseless, and Shaw's legal team, led by the formidable Michelle Lynn, swatted it away with contemptuous ease. Not only did they prove the work was entirely new, they also hinted they were in possession of evidence suggesting the reverse was true, that Pierce's early successes were built on Jessica's uncredited intellectual property. Jonathan quickly and quietly dropped the claim. When legal maneuvering failed, they turned to sabotage. Suppliers who had given Nexus Properties favorable quotes suddenly pulled out, citing unforeseen inventory issues. A key structural engineer Jessica wanted for the project abruptly accepted a lucrative long-term contract with Pierce Properties, leaving her scrambling. These were Jonathan's tactics, using his weight and influence to choke a smaller competitor in its cradle. But he was fighting a ghost. For every supplier he pressured, Shaw's people found two more often, with better materials at a better price. Sebastian Shaw's network was global, and his reputation was sterling. People were eager to do business with him. Jonathan was a bully on the New York playground. Shaw was the playground's owner. Vanessa, meanwhile, launched a vicious smear campaign. She leaked doctored emails and paid for anonymous blog posts, suggesting Jessica was unstable, difficult to work with, and most cruelly that her relationship with Sebastian Shaw was inappropriate. She tried to paint Jessica as a woman who used powerful men to get ahead. The attacks were painful, but Jessica, fortified by Shaw's support and her own growing confidence, refused to be drawn into a mudslinging match. Her response was her work. She held open community meetings in Brooklyn, presenting her designs, listening to feedback, and charming the residents with her genuine passion and humility. While Vanessa was posting selfies from exclusive clubs, Jessica was on a dusty lot talking to single mothers and elderly shop owners about their neighborhood. The final desperate gambit from Jonathan came a week before the competition winner was to be announced. A story broke in a notorious tabloid, complete with grainy photos, alleging that Nexus Properties' proposed site for the Brooklyn hub had soil contamination issues that were being covered up. The story claimed the site was unsafe for a daycare. It was a lie, but a potent one, designed to sow fear and derail the project indefinitely. This time, Shaw didn't just defend. He counterattacked. His investigators traced the source of the story back to a shell PR firm, which they then linked directly to Vanessa Dubois's agency. They also discovered the independent geologist quoted in the article had received a $100,000 payment from an offshore account connected to Pierce Properties. Shaw didn't leak this to the tabloids. He delivered the entire dossier, complete with bank records and email chains, to the district attorney's office and the lead reporter at the Wall Street Journal. The fallout was catastrophic for Jonathan and Vanessa. The story wasn't just about a smear campaign anymore. It was about potential witness tampering, corporate espionage, and financial crimes. The focus shifted entirely from Nexus's soil to Pierce's dirty dealings. Simultaneously, the deep dive Shaw's team had been conducting into the Azure Spire came to fruition. An anonymous tip, backed by a mountain of evidence provided by Shaw, was sent to the Department of Buildings about the substandard materials and fraudulent safety inspections at Jonathan's flagship project. Construction on the Azure Spire was halted pending a full investigation. Investors grew nervous. The high-interest loans Jonathan had taken out were suddenly at risk of being called in. The entire gleaming facade of his empire began to crack under the pressure. He and Vanessa had tried to extinguish a small flame, and in doing so had accidentally set their own house on fire. Amidst the chaos, the Brooklyn City Planning Committee made their announcement. The winner of the design competition by a unanimous vote was Nexus Properties. Jessica Collins was going to build her community hub. She had won, not by fighting on their terms, but by building on her own. The collapse of Jonathan Pierce's empire was as swift as it was brutal. The Wall Street Journal expose on the Azure Spire's fraudulent construction was a death blow. The headline was stark: "The hollow spire, greed, fraud, and substandard steel at the heart of the Pierce empire." The city's Department of Buildings red-tagged the entire project, a gleaming monument to Jonathan's hubris, now a symbol of his disgrace. His investors, led by a consortium that had gotten wind of Shaw's internal report, pulled their funding and filed a massive lawsuit. The banks called in their loans. Pierce Properties, leveraged to the hilt and built on a foundation of lies, imploded. Bankruptcy was declared within a month. Jonathan, the golden boy of Manhattan real estate, became a pariah overnight. He was facing multiple federal investigations for fraud, bribery, and racketeering. His assets were frozen, his reputation shattered. Vanessa Dubois, the woman who had prided herself on being a master of public relations, found her own reputation irrevocably tainted. Her agency was implicated in the smear campaign, and clients began to flee in droves. Seeing the sinking ship, she did what she did best. She cut her losses and tried to save herself. She gave a tearful, exclusive interview, painting herself as yet another victim of Jonathan's manipulative web. "I was blinded by his charm," she claimed, dabbing a perfectly dry eye. "I had no idea about the illegalities. I am a woman who was used by a powerful, corrupt man." She publicly disavowed him, packed her bags, and was last seen boarding a flight to Monaco, hoping to find a new billionaire to attach herself to her reputation in New York, in tatters. She abandoned Jonathan without a second thought, leaving him to face the consequences alone. Jessica watched all of this from a distance. There was no joy, no sense of victory in their downfall. There was only a quiet, somber sense of justice. She was too busy to gloat. The groundbreaking for the Brooklyn Community Hub, now named the Phoenix Project, was scheduled. She was managing contractors, approving material orders, and finalizing blueprints. She was also preparing for another more personal project, the birth of her son. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, whom she named Benjamin a week before the first foundation was poured for her building. She held him in her arms in the quiet of her new, comfortable apartment, one she had chosen and paid for herself, and felt a sense of peace that had been absent for years. He was hers. Her future was hers. The divorce proceedings were a formality. Jonathan, facing financial ruin and possible prison time, had no fight left in him. Michelle Lynn negotiated a settlement that wasn't about money. There was little left to take, but about closure. Jessica was granted sole legal and physical custody of Benjamin. Jonathan signed away his parental rights in exchange for Jessica agreeing not to participate as a witness in several of the civil lawsuits against him. He was effectively erased from their lives. 6 months later, Jessica stood on the observation deck of a nearly completed building. It was not a cold glass tower, but her building, the Phoenix Project. Sebastian Shaw stood beside her, looking not at the skyline but at her. "It's even better than the drawings," he said, his voice filled with pride. Jessica smiled, shifting baby Benjamin in his carrier strapped to her chest. "That's because buildings aren't just drawings. They have to live and breathe with the people inside them." Below, she could see the framework of the daycare's playground, the space for the rooftop garden, the large windows of the senior tech lab. It was a place of hope, of connection, a place with a soul. She looked out at the familiar Manhattan skyline, at the distant, disgraced skeleton of the azure spire. She was no longer the woman trapped in a penthouse, looking out at a world that wasn't hers. She was here in the heart of a community, a creator, a mother, a survivor. She hadn't sought revenge. She had sought to build. And in the end, what she built was not just a building, but a new life, stronger and more beautiful than the one that had been taken from her. Her foundation was no longer a lie, but was made of resilience, talent, and the quiet, unbreakable strength of a mother's love. So what is the true measure of strength? Is it the height of the skyscrapers you build, or the strength of the foundation you lay? Jessica Collins's story shows us that real power isn't about wealth or fame. It's about integrity. She was pushed from the highest penthouse to the lowest point of her life, betrayed by the man who should have protected her and her unborn child. But in the ashes of that betrayal, she rediscovered her own fire. She didn't just get revenge. She rendered it irrelevant by building a better world, a better future on her own terms. Her journey is a powerful reminder that the empires built on lies will always crumble, but a life built on talent, resilience, and love will not only stand tall, but will inspire others. If this story of strength and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that matter. Thank you for listening.